The world is changing fast. New technologies, shifting social landscapes, and evolving ways of living can feel both exciting and overwhelming. So, how do we find balance? I'm Stephanie von Bismarck, activist, author, and digital educator. Welcome to my podcast, How Do We Manage? Today, we're diving into the topic of neurodiversity, something that seems very prevalent in our society, and I'm sure we'll come back to it many times. It's estimated that 15 to 20% of the global population are neurodiverse. It's a term that covers all sorts of conditions, including autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and dyspraxia. In the US, around 7.1 million children have an ADHD diagnosis, whilst more than 1 in 10 people in the UK are thought to be on the autistic spectrum. My guest for this episode is someone who understands neurodiversity from both a personal and a professional perspective. Lucinda Miller is a naturopath and best-selling author whose work focuses on the links between nutrition and brain health. She also has ADHD, and so does her husband and 2 of her children. She really has lots of interesting and practical advice on how to manage the symptoms of neurodiversity through diet, and also how to celebrate the amazing gifts and qualities someone with neurodiversity can bring to life. Lucinda Miller, thank you so much for joining me here today. I think this is an extremely interesting topic that we're going to talk about today.
Stephanie, it's amazing to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me on.
So we hear that word neurodivergent a little bit like as if it's trending right now. Can you explain a little more for the listeners what it actually means?
Yes, it's an umbrella term that's sort of come together over the last few years to describe people who think or behave, or their brains are wired in a slightly different way to what is seen as the more typical normal brain. So neurodivergent brains are often people who have a diagnosis of dyslexia. So they find it difficult to maybe read, write, spell. It may be something like dyspraxia, where maybe coordination or planning, executive function may be an issue. There may be ADHD, which is more kind of hyperactivity, impulsivity, but equally there's an inattentive ADHD where the person may be more kind of a daydreamer. But less attentive. And then there's autism. And autistic people are often, they have specialist subjects. They're very focused on same and so forth. And there can be in children a significant speech delay and overall developmental delay. There are many other aspects to neurodivergence as well. It includes things like Down syndrome, some aspects of chronic fatigue, some aspects of mental health. So it's where someone's brain is working in a different way for a very long time.
Is that something we're born with, or is that something that you can also, due to whatever external factors, can happen to you, so to speak?
So there's very strong evidence that genetically there are hundreds of genes that have been identified that as a combination and with an interaction with the environment can lead to these types of brains. So it is very heritable, as in it's likely that when you look back, even if someone, your grandfather or your great uncle or, your mother may not have had a full diagnosis, but you can see traits in them. However, there is also acquired neurodivergence. So people who maybe have had a head injury, for instance, a very nasty car accident, concussion, again, as we know, can have some sort of cognitive decline and changes in their brain. Equally, there are children, for instance, who will have a nasty infection, which could cause encephalitis, so inflammation in the brain.
Okay.
And there are some children that we see, particularly in our clinic at NatureDoc, who have been affected significantly by streptococcus infection, which can lead to something called pans pandas, which is an inflammation of the basal ganglia at the back of the brain. And this can lead to tics, OCD, and high anxiety. So these are things that could be seen as another aspect of neurodivergence, but actually it's come on since that infection.
But it manifests itself similarly.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is where it's important to try and have individual attention with someone who suspects or is presenting with some sort of neurodivergent traits, because very often, it's very, psychiatrists can look at someone and say, well, they're showing these traits, it must be this. But actually, it's not looking at the biology underlying and understanding what else might be going on, or looking more at the history of when things may have changed. But I think a lot of people, in history, have had neurodivergent brains, but we just haven't had this terminology.
Yeah.
So you've got utterly brilliant people, creatives. Einstein was suspected probably to be neurodiverse, et cetera, et cetera. So many people who've created fabulous, groundbreaking work are actually, they may not have had such good social skills, or they might have had a very hyperactive brain, or they might just be thinking very much in 3D. So these people, the neurodiverse brain can be utterly brilliant. However, what the issue is that they are very sensitive brains, and therefore they're very sensitive to the environment, to infections, to toxins, to foods, to light, sound. And therefore, that can manifest in these things called comorbidities. So comorbidities are the problems that can go alongside the neurodivergence. So it could be, autistic children, for instance, up to 84% of autistic children have a significant gut issue. Reflux, constipation, allergies, inflammatory bowel disease, etc. Many have atopic conditions, eczema, asthma, hay fever.
Does it just go along with it, or is it something that the body reacts like a psychosomatic reaction just because they're so sensitive?
We don't really know yet. Obviously, lots of people have these conditions and are not neurodiverse, but it's more like they come along more so and alongside. So another aspect is something called hypermobility, or very bendy joints. And
my daughter has that.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. So I think more and more researchers are looking at neurodiversity as a whole body experience rather than just a difference in the brain. So there are just so many aspects to neurodivergence, and this is where we at NatureDoc, our clinic, we're sort of neurodivergence friendly. We're there to look at all the other aspects that are going on. Because what's amazing is when you support, say, those mast cells, which are those allergy cells, that calms down the body, but it also calms down the brain. Because histamine, which is part of this picture, used to be seen as a neurotransmitter. And if you have too much histamine in your brain goes too fast. And loads of people with ADHD have a very, very fast brain. Their brain's working far too quickly, and therefore they find it difficult to process. Their working memory is very poor. And when their brain calms down and they're less hyperactive and their brain's less hyperactive, then they can focus and concentrate.
One of the most fantastic things is, and makes you so credible and so warm with all of this, is that you have also been diagnosed, right? When were you diagnosed? How did it happen?
Well, it was interesting because actually my husband had been diagnosed just before we got together. And so therefore, in the early days, we were talking about his diagnosis, and it just rang so many bells with me. But, I thought, well, I'm all right. And then we had our first baby, and then the wheels started falling off in terms of my ability to cope. My brain felt completely scattered.
Okay.
And I didn't feel confident just being a mum at that point, and caring for this little one. So he said, I really think you should go along and see if you have it too, because we've had these conversations. It seems like you probably do. So I went to the psychiatrist and came back with a clear diagnosis.
But did it actually hinder you or affect your daily life before? Or was it really the birth of a child that sort of made it more clear?
I think there were two aspects to it. First of all, I think as a single girl, I'd been able to kind of manage
As
things,
we do.
How you could just say no to something, or, if you were late, you were late, or, if you hadn't cleaned your flat, it was okay. Or you hadn't paid your bills, you got into trouble, but, it was your problem. But I think when you've got a little one and your hormones are really out of whack, so remember, after the birth, you're very depleted, and those nutrients that are so important for the ADHD brain can become quite low. Equally, you're tired, so your brain is going to be more scattered. So I think everything is magnified,
of course,
during this time, and it can be magnified during different changes in your hormones over life. So the perimenopause, for instance, is another time where ADHD can suddenly sort of start raging again. But going back to that, is I really wanted to have another baby, and at that point, because this was 24 years ago. So it was a long time ago. This was before all of the social media and
all
everything,
the trends,
and everyone talking about it.
Yeah.
No one was really sure if you could take the medication and be pregnant and breastfeeding.
Okay.
And I didn't want to play any risks. So I thought, I've got to manage this myself. So I read lots of books about it and just the practical things about managing your day-to-day and just looking at ways to be organized, because I knew things like to-do lists didn't work for me, for instance. Yeah. So those things I put in place. But then the nutrition, because I was a naturopath already, I kind of thought, I'm going to read more about this brain and how to support it. And there were some really good early writings at that point about the gut-brain axis, about the effect of blood sugar on the brain, and also nutrient deficiencies. So I sort of did a deep dive into that, and it made such a difference to me. My husband didn't like the medication, so he was keen to make some changes too. And so we did that together, and it helped us both. We then realized that if we were having children, and it's strongly genetic, that at least one of our children would have ADHD. In fact, 2 out of 3 have it. One is also dyspraxic. And therefore, we had to do it for all of us, really.
What changes did you make that really made a difference for you?
Well, I think the very first step that we made that really made a difference, and we still stick to today, is to have a high-protein breakfast.
Mm-hmm.
So things like eggs, yogurt, cheese, peanut butter even. Even if we're having a granola, lots of nuts and seeds on top, lots of good quality Greek yogurt, etc. This morning, which is one of the recipes in Brain Brilliance, I had eggs with feta cheese and there's some chickpea flour in there to give it some extra protein and fibre. And that's absolutely delicious. It's like a crispy omelette.
What does the protein do to the brain that helps it?
Well, first of all, as a basic, it stabilizes blood sugar. Remember, you haven't eaten for 10 to 12 hours, and so therefore you can wake up with quite low blood sugar, and therefore it just lifts you a bit. Mm-hmm. It helps to prevent sugar highs and lows, so therefore your brain is more even during the day, more consistent. Because I think one of the big things with ADHD is you feel inconsistent. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You're very high and low. And it's not just the mood, it's the energy, it's the brain stamina. You're looking for more consistency. And that's when you get the dopamine, you feel a bit more consistent. Mm-hmm, so that really helps. But the big thing, going back to dopamine is the key neurotransmitter, which is so associated with ADHD. It helps with focus, concentration. It helps with kind of that excitement and that motivation to want to achieve a goal. The sort of underlying sort of building block to create dopamine is something called tyrosine, which is an amino acid, which essentially comes from protein. Mm-hmm. So if you're eating a protein-rich food, you're first in the morning, what you're doing is you're creating that building block, that foundation, that tyrosine. And then you need good quality iron. So that could be from eggs, it could be from meat, it could be from even prunes and apricots, will then help you convert that tyrosine into the dopamine. Yeah. So that's where that really good sort of grounding food first thing in the morning can be very vital.
So that's also something you would recommend to parents of children, like focus on a high-protein breakfast to start the day?
Yes, absolutely. So most kids They just want a bowl of cereal.
Yeah. It's fast and sugary.
And, they just want a sugary hit. And often the ADHD kids wake up in a rage. They're cross, they're angry because their blood sugars are so low.
Yeah.
So we find that neurodivergent kids often have, well, actually adults as well, they find it quite glitchy to get the right amount of glucose in the brain, and therefore it can affect their mood quite a lot. They can become hangry, dysregulated just because they haven't eaten. So you can imagine actually a bowl of cereal is going to make them feel really good straight away.
Yeah, sure.
The trouble is, then, of course, their blood sugars go whizzing up and then they go crashing down just as quickly. So 45 minutes later, on the way to school, they have a meltdown. Then, they're unfocused, distressed, etc. at school. And, the rest of the day goes out of whack. So even if they do love that bowl of cereal, try and get an egg or two on the side, maybe give them a yogurt. Even adding protein to a smoothie is okay. You can get some cashew nut butter in there or some hemp seeds or some chia seeds, just something to sort of stabilize their blood sugar. And then they fly.
We're talking, you just already mentioned it, the gut-brain axis. When did that spark your interest? When it was like, when did you understand that whatever we put in our belly, so to speak, will actually really have these effects? Because there's so much research these days, which is super exciting. My younger daughter works in this area. So this gut-brain axis, tell us a little bit more and why it is so important.
Well, first of all, I'm going to tell you a story about my son, because this is what sparked the whole thing. So we knew from school and from what we could observe with him, it was highly likely he had ADHD and dyspraxia. He was 5 years old, so he was too young for those diagnoses. So school said, wait for a couple of years and see, if he's still like this in a couple of years' time. Mm. And we thought, can we really just wait and see? There must be more that we can do, because he's really struggling with everything from friendships. He was developing a tic. He was really not happy as well and not thriving at school. I'd started to learn more about the neurodiverse brain and nutrition, and there was this thing called the gut microbiome. And I thought, I'm going to send off some tests for him and see what might be going on. So I organised a proper gut microbiome test for him. Mm-hmm. And his gut had never been quite right for quite a long time. So my hunch was it was something to do with his gut. Anyway, he came back and he had, when I say a parasite, it's not a worm or anything else, but it was a microscopic parasite in the gut. And so at that time, what I could establish was he needed something called an antimicrobial, so a herb to help remove the parasite. Yeah. And then he needed a probiotic, so a beneficial bacteria to sort of rebalance thing. So I put those in, and I kid you not, 3 days later, he woke up, he got dressed, he was doing his homework and making his breakfast. And I was like, I'd never seen such a bright button.
Wow.
And I said,
what a change.
What's going on? He goes, my brain's not playing hide and seek anymore. I can concentrate.
Oh my God, that's so lovely.
Little squidgy 5-year-old was just amazing. Oh. And I thought, wow, this really, really is a thing. When you've read about it, but then you see it in your own child. So that's where I just did the biggest deep dive ever into understanding the gut microbiome and understanding why it might be influencing the brain. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about it and why I think it is a thing. So inside our bellies is this incredible ecosystem full of bacteria, viruses, parasites, all sorts of things. And they usually lives in fantastic harmony. So imagine it a bit like a sort of meadow in May where it's just sort of abundant and you've got flora and fauna and everything's just glowing. Yeah. And if you've got a glowing meadow and a glowing gut, then you've got, a good immune system. You're going to be digesting well. You're going to be creating the right vitamins and minerals. You're going to also be creating these neurotransmitters, these brain chemicals. But if there's a nasty storm, there's lots of pesticides sprayed over, and suddenly it turns into a brown mess, then guess what? That's not going to be thriving as much. And all those other aspects like the immune system, those vitamins, the neurotransmitters are going to be less productive, less easy to make. So in the modern world, we take a lot of antibiotics these days.
Yeah, unfortunately.
We have these reflux medications, which can make you feel more comfortable, but can reduce the diversity in the gut.
Mm-hmm.
We've got this clean living. Our food is all in packaging. There's no bacteria in there. We haven't got any mud on our vegetables. Children are often inside on their screens and not outside in the fresh air. We're closing our windows because we're worried about, people entering our houses. And so therefore, we're just not getting this lovely boost to our gut microbiome that we need, this natural boost. And take then a child that's a highly fussy eater who will only eat chicken nuggets or pizza and hasn't ever eaten a vegetable, then that's not going to help because, of course, vegetables and fruits and nuts and seeds and whole grains, live yogurts, kefirs, all these things help to nourish the gut microbiome and help to make it that glorious meadow. And so if they're missing as well, and they've been sick with lots of antibiotics, etc., you can just see where...
No, that meadow is not nice anymore.
No, it really isn't. It's very brown and sludgy. And this affects these things called neurotransmitters. So in the gut, certain bacteria help to make certain neurotransmitters. It's an amazing researcher called Leo Galland who's sort of pioneered this. So he found that lactobacillus, so lactobacillus, which is in yogurt, it's in kefir, it's even in sauerkraut, and this is brilliant. It helps you digest milk, it helps with your immune system, it's fabulous. But it also helps to make something called acetylcholine. And acetylcholine helps with things like working memory and processing. It helps with things like self-regulation and emotional regulation. And guess what? That is the sort of thing that so many neurodiverse kids have troubles with.
Yeah.
And they've often had ear infections, they've had antibiotics, they're dairy-free, so they're just not getting that lactobacillus.
So if now a parent comes to your practice and let's given that the child has been just diagnosed or most likely has some sort of neurodivergency, what do you do? Where do you start?
Well, what we would do is we would have a chat about their health history and their diet history. And very often they say, well, they were really colicky when they were little. And so we took them off dairy and they were much better. And then they had lots of antibiotics for ear infections, etc. And now they've got this diagnosis. And you're thinking, oh, I wonder if that's something to do with the gut microbiome. So then we would run a stool test, we would run a gut microbiome test and a gut function test because we're also interested in how well that person's digesting and absorbing, not just about the biome. And then we will look to see what's missing and then try and sort of replace those and so encourage them to grow through either mainly diet, but also through supplements as well.
Okay, and would you say are there like 3 main things that any family could do like right away, apart from, having the gut tested is probably a good idea with the specialists. Is there anything else one can do to really make a change pretty right away, apart from also incorporating protein? We heard that. Is there something more?
It's trying to get in as many fruits and vegetables as possible because the different pigments or polyphenols, so those lovely bright colours in different berries or different coloured carrots or different coloured peppers, all of those help to enhance the gut microbiome. So even if it's just giving them a brightly coloured smoothie in the morning, just piles with lots of different things in it, that's okay. Or grating carrot into the porridge or courgette into the brownie, just a way to get those fruits and vegetables in. And it could be, as I said, nut butters, it could be seeds in the porridge. There are so many different ways you can help to enhance the gut microbiome. Equally, you could think if they can do dairy, let's give them a nice bowl of yogurt for pudding, after supper, or some kefir in their smoothie. And again, that's really, really good. But another just simple thing is getting them outside, getting them into the mud, into the fresh air.
That's why I once said farmers' kids, people or very much in the countryside who live in the dirt, they mostly have the best immune system.
Absolutely. Less asthma, less allergies, etc. So I think that's a really important thing to do too, So it's not just about the diet. And so often parents will say, I don't know how to shift the diet yet because they're so highly selective. But what you can do is you can clean up the environment. You can open the windows, you can get the fresh air in, you can get rid of... So some of the household chemicals that are zapping all the bacteria in the house, you can sort of, just swap to things like vinegar and lemon juice and things like that instead.
Yeah, you were just hinting towards it because I know that, children who are neurodivergent in whatever way, they're sometimes very, very picky and fussy eaters, and they really have issues with colors and some textures. How can I sort of identify the like a real proper reason behind that? So sometimes it's tough for parents, right?
Yeah, so there are lots of aspects to this, and I'll cover as many as I can because it's a really important part of the picture. Is first of all, neurodiverse people generally are very sensory or sensitive to their sensory environment. So it can be noise, it can be light, it can be taste, it can be texture. Now, this is because often their neurological system, so their nervous system, finds it difficult to regulate. And actually that's where supplements and nutrition can really, really help to sort of ground them.
Yeah.
Okay. So things become less of an issue. So they can cope more with maybe strong tastes or different textures, etc. So first of all, it's thinking how to support that nervous system. Is it through food, as I said, or could it be through, literally gargling, humming, singing, swimming in cold water? Those sorts of things are very regulating on the nervous system. But the big thing we find with these kids is often there's an underlying gut issue. So they're the kid that's always been quite refluxy, or they've had a slow motility, so they're really constipated or find it very difficult to go to the loo. Or there are multiple allergies, and so therefore they're scared of food. So that's a big aspect. So doing that gut microbiome test and then working to soothe the gut and calm the gut can make a massive difference. But the big one that we find that I think is probably the main thing that makes the biggest difference too is what's very interesting is that when you dig deep into the research, you find that many people who are neurodiverse are born with something called a low zinc status. So zinc is a very important mineral for many different aspects of the body. And this has been found in different research from dyslexia to ADHD to autism.
Interesting.
And this is no blame. It's purely because zinc is used up on so many pathways in the body. There's not much in our food chain anymore. You'd have to have lots of shellfish, which you're told not to have when you're pregnant, for instance, and liver, So there's a lot of foods you can't eat that are zinc rich. And equally, genetically, when you look at all the ways the body deals with dopamine, adrenaline, serotonin, zinc plays a very important role. So it's very, very key. So it's a nervous system regulator. But what's really interesting about it is it helps to make gastric juices. So it actually turns on that hunger.
Okay.
And also it helps with sense of smell and taste. Now, how many people have been through, say, the COVID virus, lost their sense of smell and taste?
Yeah.
Food tastes really boring. It's a very boring experience.
Yes, very.
If you can't smell
I was there. I was like, it's not fun.
It's really not fun. So imagine if that's your permanent state.
Yeah, no, it's horrendous.
And equally, because zinc's so important with the nervous system, it can actually alter texture perception as well in the mouth. So first of all, if you're low in zinc, as I said, if it doesn't smell too much or taste too much, you're going to be seeking out some sort of sensory input to make that meal a bit more interesting. So if it's crunchy, or you can hear it in the mouth or feel it in the mouth, then actually that's better than something that's slurpy and is just going to feel a bit funny in the mouth. So the zinc, what is clever is zinc drops, which are the supplements that you can give, can go in apple juice, orange juice, even in food.
Oh, great.
And therefore, what you can do is to rebuild those zinc levels over, 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes 3 months. And very often within that period, they start becoming more interested and more curious in food.
Oh, wow. Okay. So, wow. Okay. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Just a few zinc drops.
Yeah. It's really good because so many parents say, we have tried everything to try and expand their diet. And they're fixed on this one particular pizza, this one particular yogurt. They won't eat anything else.
Yeah.
I don't know, there's this barrier and we can't get through. And we find that zinc is really important. Also, iron levels, often they're anemic or very low in iron. And again, so iron's the most abundant mineral in your central nervous system, and then zinc's the second most. So those two together are really vital. And if you have low iron, you can have a sore mouth, a sore tummy. So there's sort of very small appetite kind of picture, and they're pale and withdrawn and sort of just not feeling themselves. So very often, if you can get the iron levels up and the zinc levels up, yes, they're supplements. Sometimes it's a battle to get them in, but often they taste quite nice. They're sweet or whatever. You can get them in. And then literally, as I said, 6 weeks, 3 months, you just see this child just opening up and they're more excited about food and they're suddenly, taking something off your plate, or just, you go to someone else's house and they eat something that they've never eaten before.
That is fantastic. So zinc and iron is something to focus on. Perhaps trying with one of those, I love the liquid supplements, if they don't have to swallow anything.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it takes a while for kids to learn to swallow. And actually, neurodiverse kids often have this hypermobility. So they have quite bendy joints. Which also can affect things like ability to swallow. So actually, they can take longer to learn how to swallow a capsule.
Would these be applied quite generally? Is that something that would help most neurodiverse children, or are there certain diets or something that would work better for certain conditions?
I think the most important thing to start off with is a nutrient-dense diet. So a diet that has as many different vitamins and minerals in each mouthful as you can. So that's why I love things like, a black bean brownie that's got iron and protein and fiber. And then, maybe, you've got waffles that have got good quality eggs and sun-dried tomatoes, and so everything's got more nutrition in it. Because usually what I find is these kids are deficient in a wide range of nutrients because they've been quite fixated on just a small handful of foods.
And what if I have a very limited budget and I can't really afford to go to the organics market and all of that? What would be my go-to foods that could really benefit my child?
Yeah, so I think, start with things like oats. And then oats you can supercharge. So if you're making a porridge, you could supercharge with cracking an egg in there to give it the protein and the healthy fats. You could have some sunflower seeds, for instance, which are very cheap, so to add to that as well. Good quality, whole milk, for instance, is not going to be any different from the semi-skim. So it's just getting that extra protein and extra fat. So the extra fat will have more vitamin D, more omega-3. Equally, things like tins of beans. So as I said, the black bean.
Lentils, beans,
things like that. Now, what I tend to do in the recipes that I do is to use chickpea flour, red lentil flour, which you can make yourself. So you literally get the dried chickpeas or the dried lentils and you whiz them up in a kind of a good coffee grinder or something like that to turn it into a flour. And it takes less than a minute to do. So you've got these cheap beans and pulses at home that you can then whiz up, at the time. And then those can then go and turn into waffles, they can turn into muffins, they can turn into biscuits, etc. So they can be really nutritious, or you can stir them into sauces.
Have you had a few success stories, one or two you might share, where you perhaps even helped a family or a child with the things that you are sort of doing, that they even could live without the medication for some time, and it really just helps to manage their life in that way?
So this is with ADHD. So unless an autistic person has significant rage and aggression, there's generally no medication for autism as such. Equally with dyslexia and things like that, again, no. But with ADHD, there is these stimulant medications. They're stimulants. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. Now, the stimulant medications work for about 4 to 8 hours, depending on which one is chosen. So that helps the child to focus, concentrate. They usually have much greater academic achievement when they take them. However, during that time, their appetite is very suppressed usually. So they're not hungry. So it means that often then when it's all wearing off at, say, 4:00 in the afternoon, suddenly they're starving and then they start binging. So there's sort of positives and negatives to these medications. I think the biggest issue that we see is more so in boys. I'm not saying it doesn't affect girls too, but it can affect their growth because if they're missing out on one meal a day, essentially, and then they're eating snacky stuff rather than, proper nutritious food, then that can affect their growth. So often they're held behind. They just seem smaller than the rest of their peers. And that can affect their mental health and their self-esteem and things like that. So it's important to, work on that. Also, there are lots of kids who find that they find the stimulants too overstimulating. They feel jittery, they can't sleep, they just don't feel right. There are some kids, there's one, he must be about 16 or 17 now, that I look after, and he's a very, very good rugby player. And he says when he takes the medication, he can't play his rugby. He's really rubbish at rugby, which is interesting. So he's very good academically when he takes it, but it affects his sport. So I think, you've got to look at things and, so with these ADHD medications, yes, sometimes they're advised to be taken every day, but a lot of the time, especially the older children, take it when they need it rather than every single day. And certainly they might take it Monday to Friday, but not the weekends, purely so that they can catch up. So therefore, a lot of people are looking for alternatives in terms of, nutrition, etc. Most of the time, people are medicated, but are also looking for additional help with their emotional dysregulation or their sleep or just their diet, So we're doing a lot of work alongside. So most of what we're doing is complementary. But going back to a story about this is quite an extreme story, but it just shows the power of food.
Okay.
So this is a 12-year-old boy. I'll call him Tom. That's not his real name. Tom has been excluded from 5 schools. Essentially, his parents have been told that it is likely he will not be able to go to school. And if he did, his behaviour is so severe that it may have a 10-foot wall, as in, he's really not good. So his typical day was to take an ADHD medication in the morning, and that would regulate him a bit. He would then also need some in the afternoon because his behaviour was so extreme that it was the only way that they could cope. Now, this behaviour, he was essentially eloping, escaping from the house every evening, going to the local petrol station, binging on sugar and crisps and whatever, going completely hyperactive, jumping on cars, jumping on roofs, throwing sticks and stones, basically completely dysregulated. And they would find him curled up in a ball somewhere at 1 a.m.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Exhausted. Anyway, so I spoke to the parents and I said, I can't do a proper consultation for 2 weeks. They said, we're desperate. What could we do now? So I said, what does he eat? And he said, well, we're allergic to nuts and we can't have gluten in the house, but he does love pizza and he loves hot chocolate. And I said, would he eat anything else? He said, probably not at the moment. So I said, okay, so my red lentil pizza, which has red lentil base, so lots of lovely protein. And then I sort of created this hot chocolate, which had collagen. And then I added a bit of magnesium, which is very calming. And then there's a supplement called theanine, which is normally in tea, which is very calming as well. So I thought I'd get that in because I knew they wouldn't taste or change the...
Yeah.
Anyway, I spoke to them 2 weeks later, and I kid you not, Tom's behaviours have reduced by 70%.
That is absolutely incredible.
He has now stopped his 5 o'clock ADHD medication. He's now fast asleep by 8 o'clock every evening, and he's eating food like gusto. He's just loving his food.
That's just an incredible story.
Yeah. So that was the beginning.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he's doing very well now. But it's just, I think it's important to talk about an extreme story because then you sort of see, well, actually, I might be able to do that for my child who's just mildly, unfocused or whatever.
So, Lucinda, it really feels as if ADHD is like trending at the moment. There's so many people talking about it. It feels as if more and more people are diagnosed with it. Could one of the reasons for that rise also be rooted in our 21st century diet? or any other external factors that could contribute to this?
I think so. I mean, I think there are many different layers to this. And I mean, first of all, obviously awareness. I mean, social media has done a phenomenal job at everyone thinking
it's
they've
not
got
always
ADHD
bad.
or something, you know.
It's good.
So, you know, it's something that I think a lot of people have, that pandemic gave everyone that pause to be able to really think and understand themselves a bit more. So I think, social media has played a massive role. Obviously, our screens has, it's made us all very distracted.
Yeah.
So I think, again, our lives are very busy and faster than they've ever been. So those will be big, big factors. The gut microbiome is hugely depleted. So there was an amazing study done 100 years ago on babies, comparing breastfed babies and bottle-fed babies. And as you can imagine, the gut microbiome of the breastfed babies was hugely more diverse than the bottle-fed babies.
Yeah.
But fast forward 100 years, they repeated that test, and that they found that the breastfed babies of today have less of that diversity than the bottle-fed babies 100 years ago. Yeah. And obviously the bottle-fed babies are even worse. So everyone's gut microbiome is depleted, and that's not being helped by ultra-processed foods that have been lasered to take away the bacteria, etc., etc. I think we're all eating differently, even in the last 10 years, than we were ever before. And this is not meant to be any blame on any specific foods, but, it's the rise of the plant-based milks. It's lots of people having protein bars and lots of ultra-processed things in packages. We've been told we haven't got enough time to cook. And most of those ultra-processed foods do not have the zinc, the iron, the omega-3, all those vital things for our brains. There's lots of starches in there, but less of the good stuff, less of the protein. Even the protein, bars and things like that, they tend to be, just harder to digest and absorb.
And high sugar everywhere. Everywhere there's the sugar. Yeah.
Whether it's in your coffee, whether it's in... And a lot of things, as I said, it's not necessarily the sugar. There are lots of foods that don't have any added sugar, but what they've done instead is they've put modified starch. So this is things like rice starch, potato starch, maize starch. And these help to make things thicker and make them shine. They help those tomato sauces to look stunning and beautiful. Equally, they're there in a lot of the free-from foods. A lot of people think, I'm going to go gluten-free, for instance. And again, you look at the ingredients on the bread, and it's all starches. And these starches are really disrupting the blood sugars. And if you've got a sensitive brain, it's going to make it worse.
Yeah. I had this, I lived in the United States for a while, and they had these pesticides, right, on plants, and I had some fruit trees. I had this fantastic gardener who was very much into nature, and then she said to me, well, we're going to now take away all these pesticides. I'm going to tell you, your trees are going to look horrible. They're going to go into shock. You're going to think they're going to die. Because basically what you're doing is taking constant antibiotics away. The plants have an immune system in exclamation marks as well. They're going to go into shock. And that happened, and it's tough if you look at your trees and you think, oh my God, if this is continued, doesn't look nice. But it took a year or 1.5, and they grew back into full bloom. And
better than before,
and
probably.
They were only fed sort of certain minerals. It was a mineral thing that she was putting on the roots and water. And they were strong. It was an absolutely incredible experience to see how they actually grew stronger. And okay, then those apples, I never tested them for nutrients or anything.
Of course.
But you can understand that, with all the stuff we're doing, we're really, really harming ourselves, and that we have to be extremely aware of what's happening, and that the food industry or what we're putting out there is really not beneficial to all of us.
No, I think we should all learn to cook. I think it should be part of the school curriculum.
I so agree, yeah.
So that children start their adulthood knowing how to cook, prioritizing feeding themselves as such a high part of their lives, to actually put aside that time.
Yeah. Well, I love to cook, for example, and my children grew up like that. But for me, food is joy, and it's a passion, it's a hobby of mine. But I have had many kids where they sort of were not very interested, but they came as friends or as guests, and by the second or third time, children actually stand in the kitchen. They actually, they watch you, they look at you, and then they start getting interested. It's really sometimes also the introduction to it, right? And around it.
I've had the same, I've had teenagers come to stay in their mum's wrong and said, they don't eat any fruit or veg. And I go, challenge accepted.
Yeah.
And, by the end of the weekend, they've just eaten about 30 different fruits and vegetables, and mum's just blown away.
Yeah, exactly. So there's one question I always ask every guest who's on the podcast. It's like, what do you do to manage your day on a daily basis, or like a routine or something?
Great question. So, with ADHD, I will say that getting into a full routine is hard, but this is what I aim towards.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it happens every day. In the morning, the most important thing is I drink a really large glass of water when I wake up, because I'm dehydrated. I might even put an electrolyte in there, and that makes a massive difference to me. I then love a rebounder, which is a mini trampoline.
Okay.
And I bounce on that, and I dance to music, and it makes me laugh, and it's great for the exercise. So I do that.
Okay.
And then I take our gorgeous spaniels out for a big walk. And then I come back and have a big breakfast, which could easily be feta and eggs. And that's one of my favorites. And then, because I found this has made a matter of difference, it's very unique to me, but I have 3 or 4 squares of dark chocolate.
Oh, I'm there. I'm with you. I have it more to the end of the day, but just dark chocolate is my absolute sin and go-to.
I think it's phenomenal stuff, and it has changed my ADHD for the better. And I'm sure it's why French kids who have chocolate for breakfast every day don't have, in brackets, ADHD.
Okay.
So anyway, chocolate has been phenomenal. As I said, it's dark chocolate, and I find it's too stimulating at the end of the day, because I'm quite sensitive to caffeine. And then the day then disappears into, crazy work. So, but yeah, that's the beginning of my day, and I love it.
That sounds like a wonderful start of the day. And it's been absolutely wonderful to have you here, Lucinda.
Stephanie, it's been an absolute delight. Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to meet you, and good luck with the rest of the podcast.
Thank you so much, Lucinda Miller, for all the information shared in this episode of How Do We Manage? There was so much interesting stuff there for all of us, not just those with neurodiversity. You can find out more about Lucinda, her work, her clinic, and her books in the show notes. And we have plenty more guests who touch on brain health and nutrition coming up in the podcast. So please make sure to hit follow to get every episode straight to you. I'll hope you join me again very soon.